It has been 40 years since Nigeria's fifth military head of state, Major General Muhammadu Buhari, was overthrown in a palace coup on August 27, 1985. Buhari, the stern-faced soldier who had seized power barely 20 months earlier, found his rule abruptly cut short within the very walls of Dodan Barracks. The takeover, led by his own Chief of Army Staff, Major General Ibrahim Badamasi Babangida, was swift, silent, and precise. There were no gun battles in the streets, yet the shock resounded across the nation. For many Nigerians, the moment was as mystifying as it was sudden. Buhari had risen on the promise of discipline and reform, yet his reign was defined by strict decrees, economic hardship, and an iron-fisted war against indiscipline. Babangida, the man who once stood at his side, now stood in his place. Radio Nigeria became the nation's only window into the unfolding drama as the former Chief of Army Staff addressed the country, justifying the coup as a necessary rescue mission for a struggling nation. 40 years later, the events of that day still raise pressing questions. Was the coup truly a salvation or simply another power shift within a turbulent era of military politics? How did trusted allies turn into political rivals overnight? And what can Nigeria's present-day leaders learn from a decisive change that altered the country's course? Exactly 40 years on, we remember the palace coup against Muhammadu Buhari in this episode. By the middle of 1985, Nigeria's Supreme Military Council was no longer a united body. Major General Muhammadu Buhari, who had seized power from President Shehu Shagari in December 1983, ruled with an iron fist and an austere economic program. His regime had enforced strict import restrictions, closed the country's borders to curb smuggling, and clamped down heavily on political dissent. While these measures won him the admiration of citizens who longed for discipline in public life, they also bred resentment among certain senior officers and sections of the political elite. The economy was strained, public morale was low, and the military's inner circle was becoming increasingly uneasy with Buhari's style of governance. Major General Ibrahim Babangida, then Chief of Army Staff, emerged as the focal point of discontent. Known for his charm, political skill, and extensive network within the armed forces, Babangida quietly began to assemble a coalition of dissatisfied officers. His plan was not to stage a noisy, violent overthrow, but to execute a swift clinical takeover at the very heart of power. A true palace coup. The groundwork involved careful intelligence gathering, discreet persuasion of key commanders, and securing the loyalty of units stationed in Lagos, particularly those responsible for protecting Dodan Barracks, the seat of government. Meetings were held behind closed doors in officers' messes and private residences, always in small groups to avoid suspicion. The coup was scheduled for the early hours of August 27, 1985, when the chances of resistance would be minimal. At dawn, a great while before morning, troops loyal to Babangida quietly took control of strategic positions in Lagos. Army headquarters, communication centers, and access roads leading to Dodan Barracks. By the early morning, the seat of government was completely encircled. Buhari was isolated and effectively cut off from the outside world. He was then placed under house arrest. Soon after, Major General Ibrahim Babangida landed in Lagos from Minna and appeared on national radio to inform the nation that the rigid policies of the former government were being replaced with a more humane and dynamic approach to governance.
I'm pleased to take this opportunity to declare once again, therefore, that this administration attaches the greatest importance to constructive and helpful criticisms as well as the freedom of the press, and to declare further that the administration also attaches the greatest importance of fundamental human rights. A visible improvement in the standard of living of our people will not come overnight, of course. It is nonetheless feasible to take a meaningful action now which would alleviate the deprivation and misery of the large majority of our population within a short time. Thus, the administration will, in particular, take measures to check our galloping inflation and soaring unemployment.
With those statements, the Babangida era began. The August 27, 1985 coup was not conceived as a bloody showdown, but as a calculated palace coup executed quietly within the heart of Nigeria's military establishment. The plotters' angle was clear. They sought to remove Buhari without plunging the country into another cycle of violence. Buhari's hardline economic policies, his rigid posture on political freedoms, and the perceived drift in governance had alienated key segments of the armed forces. Babangida and his inner circle positioned themselves as saviors who would restore flexibility and diplomacy in leadership. Their strategy relied less on brute force and more on the precision of military intelligence, secrecy, and the loyalty of critical units. Timing was everything. The date chosen, August 27, 1985, was no accident. It fell on a Tuesday, a Muslim holiday, ensuring that most political and military actors who could fight them were away from the seat of power. This allowed the plotters to exploit routine movements and minimize suspicion. In the weeks before, Babangida had delicately reshuffled commands and positioned trusted allies in sensitive locations. Communications channels were quietly monitored and the movements of potential opposition figures were tracked. The early morning hours were selected for the operation, capitalizing on the slow tempo of activity in the federal capital at that time. By striking before Buhari's daily schedule began, they ensured he would be caught off guard, isolated from his support base. On the night of August 26, 1985, Buhari's isolation was almost total. His Chief of Staff, Supreme Headquarters, Major General Tunde Diagbon, was in Saudi Arabia. His Chief of Army Staff, Ibrahim Babangida, had traveled to Mina for Salah and could not be reached. His Brigade of Guards commander and aide-de-camp were under arrest. The few officers he trusted were either suddenly unavailable or openly hostile. Crucially, the National Security Organization had no combat units, and divisions loyal to Buhari were too far away to help. At Dodan Barracks, 4 majors, Umar Dangiwa, Lawan Gwadabe, Abdulmumuni Aminu, and Sambo Dasuki, were assigned to arrest Buhari. They met no resistance. The head of state, aware of the futility of the situation, reportedly ordered his own guards not to interfere. He was first taken to Bonny Camp, then placed under house arrest at 1 Oxworth Road in Ikoyi, before later being moved to Benin City. His residence at Dodan Barracks was looted by soldiers. Meanwhile, Colonel Joshua Dongoyaro entered Radio Nigeria unopposed and at 6 a.m. read the broadcast announcing Buhari's removal. By midday, Brigadier Sani Abacha followed with a second broadcast confirming Major General Ibrahim Badamasi Babangida as Nigeria's new head of state and commander-in-chief. So, What were the reasons for the palace coup against Major General Muhammadu Buhari? The palace coup of August 27, 1985, which swept Major General Muhammadu Buhari out of office, was announced to Nigerians as a patriotic rescue mission. The new regime, headed by Major General Ibrahim Babangida, claimed Buhari's government had strayed from the ideals of the 1983 coup that had brought him to power. In their broadcasts, the coup plotters accused the Buhari military government of violating human rights, detaining people without trial, muzzling the press, and executing drug traffickers under retroactive decrees. They also criticized his government for alienating intellectuals, mismanaging the counter-trade policy, and pursuing an unpopular loan from the International Monetary Fund (IMF), which they said would have deepened Nigeria's economic woes. To the public, it was packaged as an intervention to restore hope and fairness. Behind the scenes, the August 27, 1995 coup was far more personal and calculated. Many of the same officers who overthrew Buhari had been his allies when the military removed President Shehu Shagari in December 1983. At that time, Babangida was Chief of Army Staff, Brigadier Joshua Dongoyaro was a key armored officer, and Major General Sonny Abacha commanded critical military units. But in less than 2 years, cracks had emerged. Buhari's leadership style was austere and uncompromising. His centralized power relied heavily on a small circle of trusted officers and sidelined others who expected influence after the coup. Promotions moved slowly, leaving ambitious younger officers frustrated. There was also growing unease over his refusal to bend to political and economic pressures, a quality his admirers saw as integrity, but his critics called stubbornness. The spark, according to Buhari himself, was his decision to retire Colonel Aliyu Mohammed Gusau, the influential director of military intelligence. Buhari accused Gusau of receiving illegal commissions from defense contracts, a charge that, if pursued, could have damaged the careers of several top officers. Gusau was a long-term ally and friend of Babangida, and his removal threatened the balance of power within the military hierarchy. Once Buhari informed Babangida of the retirement decision, the coup machinery began moving in earnest. Intelligence reports suggest that Gusau, aware of his imminent dismissal, urged Babangida's camp to act before he was officially removed. The plan was simple: seize Buhari quietly before the news of Gusau's retirement became public, then reverse the decision by executive order under the new Babangida regime. Babangida would go on to rule for 8 years, reshaping Nigeria's political landscape with a mix of populist charm and calculated manipulation. For Buhari, it was the abrupt end of his first stint in power, a fall engineered not by public protest or battlefield defeat, but by colleagues he once trusted. "40 years on, the palace coup of August 27, 1985 still invites reflection. Was it simply an internal reshuffling of military power, or did it mark the turning point in Nigeria's political destiny? At the time, the takeover was sold to the public as a necessary intervention to save the nation from economic hardship and political rigidity. Yet, did it truly deliver on those promises, or did it pave the way for deeper cycles of instability that would haunt the country for decades? Such questions linger, not merely as historical curiosities, but as reminders of how a single dawn's event can redirect a nation's course. The memory of that morning remains vivid for those who witnessed it. There were no tanks rumbling down the streets in defiance, no prolonged gun battles to seize control. Instead, power changed hands almost silently. Could that quietness be interpreted as efficiency, or was it the sign of a system so accustomed to abrupt shifts that resistance felt futile? And what of the players themselves? Were they patriots acting in the nation's best interest, or ambitious officers driven by personal and political calculations? In those moments, the Nigerian people could only watch and listen, their fate decided behind closed doors. Today, Nigeria stands in a different age, yet the echoes of 1985 still resound. Military coups may have faded from the headlines, but have the lessons truly been learned? Has the nation found the political maturity to guard against such sudden reversals, or does the same vulnerability still lie beneath the surface? Remembering the palace coup against Muhammadu Buhari is not merely about marking an anniversary. It is about understanding how power is taken, how it is wielded, and how the stories of the morning of August 27, 1985 remain woven into the larger tapestry of Nigerian history.